Hello guys, welcome back to today's lesson. This is the third video of my free web design workshop series, and today we're going to be starting with the basics of programming. Over the last couple weeks, our first week we actually learned how to use HTML to create elements in our website, and then last week we learned how to use CSS to style our website, give it some new fonts and color, all that great stuff. Now, today we're going to be going over or sort of moving towards the logical side of web design. The past videos have all been about styling things, making our website look presentable, and adding those elements to our website. But now we're going to be focusing on JavaScript, where it's kind of like the brains of our website, where all the logic takes place, where we build our website's responsiveness and all that good stuff. Now, JavaScript is a little more complicated than HTML, CSS, because it's a actual programming language, much like Python and Java. If you ever heard of those programming languages, JavaScript has some of the core functionality that those languages have. So we're going to need to learn the basics of programming, and specifically those in the JavaScript language, for us to be able to use it in later videos. So right now we're actually not going to do any coding in our actual website, but we will be doing some coding just outside of Glitch. Actually, we're going to be using a different editor, which I'll show you how to set up. It's really easy, but let's first talk about, we're going to be doing variables, data types, and operators today, and if you don't know what these things are, we're going to go over them, but so let's get started. So let's first talk about what is the purpose of programming. Well, we program to achieve a specific task, to solve problems, and we actually do this with algorithms. Whether you know that you're creating an algorithm or not, you use algorithms in your programming. And the word algorithm is kind of a key word when it comes to computer science and programming, because most high-level or even basic programs, they involve algorithms. And algorithms are basically step-by-step tasks that work together to achieve a bigger task. For example, making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is an algorithm. First, you get the bread, then you put the peanut butter on one piece of bread and the jelly on the other, and then you put those pieces of bread together. Now, even though this is considered an algorithm, it's really not a great algorithm for a computer to follow. This is because the computer needs specific tasks that are these tasks have to be very specific for the computer to understand. For example, the computer is not going to know what it means to get bread. It's going to think, it's going to want you to specify what that means. So the main part of algorithms in computer science is that they have to be specific, and they have to follow a general step process. Alright, so what is programming? Programming is essentially communicating with the computer, and you probably were wondering when we first started our HTML and CSS and we opened Glitch, how does it know if I'm typing H1 or a certain selector in CSS? How does it know that that is going to turn into a title that is shown on the web page? How does Glitch know what that code actually prints out to be? Well, that's where the whole idea of programming comes in. Now, computers talk in binary, which is zeros and ones, and we don't understand zeros and ones. We talk in English, or whatever language you speak. So programming is that middleman in between the computer's language, which if you coded in zeros and ones, that would probably be a real headache, and it's not very fun to code in binary. But again, we can't code in English. We can't say display a title. We can't literally type display a title in the code, and the computer's not going to know what to do with that. So programming is essentially the middleman between, it's kind of like that Google Translator for human language or English to computer language, zeros and ones. Alright, so the objectives of today are variables, data types, and operators, as I mentioned before. So now we can actually get started coding. And we're not going to be using Glitch today. We're actually going to be using a new code editor that's easier to demonstrate what I want to demonstrate in. So what you can do is go to your browser or whatever search engine you're using and type repl.it. It stands for replit, or it's pronounced replit. And it's going to take you to this web page. Also, I'll leave this in the link to the description if you don't want to type it. But it's going to take you to this web page, the Replit homepage, and it's going to ask you to either start coding or sign up. You can press the start coding, and then it's going to ask you which language that you want to code in. So right here I have Node.js with this little green hexagon. So I'm going to click that, but alternately, if you don't see that showing up, all you got to do is type Node.js and it should come up here. So you're going to want to click that and click Create REPL. So it's going to load up this coding environment for us. It actually looks a little bit like Glitch. So this is the area that we're going to code in. And then this is where we can print stuff to the console, which I'm going to show you later. And these are our files. We're only going to be using one file for this. And this is not really something that you need to save. It's just something that I'm going to use to show you the programming fundamentals. So, let's just show you how this works. So I'm going to type this bit of JavaScript code. I'm going to say hello world with a comma, and we're going to run that, and we see that hello world is printed out. So the console.log, it prints whatever inside here out. This is a string. We'll again get to that later, but for now, that's just me showing you how Replit works. Alright, so let's get started with variables. Variables are essentially items that, or containers that store information. Variables can be assigned in JavaScript by using let, const, or var. So these are the three assigners we use when creating variables. I use the / here because this means it's commented out. I'm just putting this as a note here. It's not actually going to run in the code. But let's say I wanted to create a variable called number. I could say let number, and then I'm going to have to set it equal to a value. This is going to be the information we want to store in this number variable. So I'm just going to say 5. And then we always end our lines in JavaScript with a semicolon. Alright, so now we have a variable called number, and it's assigned to 5. Now you're probably wondering, what's the difference between these three? Can I just pick whatever one I feel comfortable with or I like the most? And I could just use whatever assigner I want? Well, they're actually a bit different from each other. So first, I'll go over let. Let is used when we want to create a variable that we can change later on in the program. So let's say I had number equals 5 there, but at the end, I actually wanted to set the number equal to 7 later in the program. Well, I could totally do that, and when I print this variable to the console, let's see what it says. The variable is 7. So that means I successfully changed this variable, and that's totally okay because I used the assigner let. Now const is a little bit different than let because const is again used to assign variables. However, const is used when your variable never changes. So once you assign this number is equal to 5, it's going to be equal to 5 throughout the entire program. And we see here we tried to change this variable number to 7, and let's see if we can do that. If we run this, we see that we get a nice error message, all red, very scary. So constant, or const, stands for constant, and if you've learned algebra or you haven't learned algebra, I'll tell you now, but constants never change. They stay the same. Nothing will ever change a constant, and in this case, that's what const means as well, because we can't change this variable later on or we're going to get an error. This is good for if you're actually have a constant, like a number, but it's also good if you wanted to, let's say you had a string and you never wanted that string to change, you could just assign it as a constant and you wouldn't have to worry about that. Alright, so we went over let and const, but there's also this var. Var is very similar to let, except it plays around with the locality of a variable, which I know it's a fancy word, but you really don't have to worry about var for now. I personally would stick to using let and const, but you can definitely look up var and see what it does, but sometimes it can mess things up if you use it in replacement of let. So just to be safe, and just to be safe, I would use let when creating variables that you want to change. So I'm just going to change this back to 5. Alright, so now we can start going over data types. So when we create our variables, we see that we have a let number equals 5. Well, what exactly is the data type of this variable? So the data type would actually be a number because we're assigning this variable to a number. So even if I called this variable letter, the data type would still be a number because the value 5 is a number. And we can use 5.5, negative 5.5, this is all going to be a number still. Alright, we also have variables that or data type called a string. So I'm going to create a new variable called name, and I'm going to set it equal to Alexa, which is my name. And a string is denoted by these quotations, and then inside you can put letters, numbers, symbols. You can pretty much put whatever you want in there, and it's a string because it's encapsulated in these quotations. Let me just delete that. We also have booleans. Booleans are values that are either true or false. So when you have a boolean variable, the value of that variable is either true or false. We also have the data type of null. Null essentially means nothing. And null, it's kind of difficult to understand at first, but again, it means nothing. It's not a number, it's not a letter, it's not a boolean, it's null, it's nothing. So it can be useful in some instances, but we're not really going to use null too much, so that's just something to be aware of. The last data type I want to talk about is the array. So I'm going to create a variable called array, and I'm going to set it equal to an array, which we write as, first we put these brackets, And then inside of these brackets, we can put a value. So I'm going to put 6, and then we put another value by putting a comma and then a space. And I can even put strings in here, and booleans, false, and even null I can put in here. And basically, this array groups all of these values together into one variable that we can access here. And this is really useful in programming, especially when you're making games or pretty much any time you're storing information throughout your program. You're probably going to be using an array because it's the best way to do this. And we'll get into more about arrays maybe towards our next lesson or the lesson after that, but you'll definitely see this topic come up again. So I'm just going to delete these variables and also that, and I'm going to create a variable called x and set it equal to 5, and then another variable called y and setting that equal to 10. So if I run this just to make sure it's all right, I don't get any errors, nothing prints out. So now we're going to be moving on to talk about operators. Now, operators come in many shapes and sizes and flavors. That's basically my way of telling you that there's a lot of operators in almost every programming language, but we're going to take it one by one, and first we're going to start with mathematical operators. So this is just a fancy way of saying addition, subtraction, multiplication. You can do all that with variables. For example, I'm going to create a console log here, so whatever I put in here is going to be printed on this side to the right. So I'm going to put x plus y. And if you've taken algebra, or maybe pre-algebra, you've learned this, but sometimes you have variables in your equations, and sometimes in the question they tell you what a certain variable is, and maybe you have to solve for one. But in this case, all we have to do is plug in our x, or plug in our 5 for our x, because x equals 5, and plug in our y for our 10, and then we should see that we get 15, because 5 plus 10 is indeed 15. We can also do this with subtraction. We get -5, multiplication, we get 50, division, we get 0.5. You can also do this with, there's also this other symbol in most programming languages, and it's called modulo, and we denote it by this %. So modulo is the same as dividing a number, except it returns the value of the remainder. So I'm just going to comment this. This right here, this expression, is the same as saying 5, or actually I'm going to switch these variables around so you get a better understanding. So I'm going to do y modulo x. So y modulo x is the same as saying 10, which is y, divided by 5, which is x. So when we do that, we do 5 divided by 10, but modulo actually is looking for the remainder. So if we run this, we see that we get a remainder of 0 because 5 goes into 10 evenly 2 times. But let's say we change this y to 7, and we run this again, we see that we get a remainder of 2 because 5 goes into 7 once with 2 left over. So that's the idea of modulo. Program developers made this a thing because it's actually quite useful, and you don't want to be writing a whole function to do that. So they built it into their programs, and this is it's widely used in most programming languages. You'll find modulo there. And lastly, we can do exponents. So this is basically saying y to the power of x, where y is the base and x is the exponent. So that would be 7 to the 5th power, which is going to be some large number that I didn't know existed. And there we go, it's right there. So now let's talk about incrementing and de-incrementing. So I'm just going to delete this. A lot of times in our programming, we want to increment a value of a variable or subtract from it or add from it, and we can do this in a number of ways. So let's say I wanted to increase the value of x by 1 later in the program. I could do this by doing x equals x plus 1. I'm basically reassigning this variable to x, which is 5 in this case, so x is going to equal 5 plus 1, and if we console log this, I'm going to console log x. If we run that, we see that we do indeed get 6. So it's successfully increasing it. We could also do this with subtraction, and even division. You can do this with any mathematical operator. But there's also another way to write this. And there's another way to write this because it's actually become so popular, incrementing and de-incrementing in programming, that developers who create this programming language, like the creators of JavaScript, they've built in functions to increment and de-increment in a more efficient way, or more concise way. So the first way we can do this is by doing x plus equals 1, and then this is the exact same thing as x equals x plus 1. So this expression right here is equal or the same thing as this expression. So if I run that, we still get 6. And we can change this to any number we want. We can say 2, and then it will increment by 2. And we can also change this here to a minus sign, and we subtract 2. And we can even do an exponent. That will give us 25. And basically all our operations we can put there, and it will do whatever it needs to do with that. Now there's also a final way to write this x equals x plus 1, and that is by using the plus plus. So if I do x plus plus, that is the same as this expression here, and it's the same as x plus equals 1. So all of these expressions are equivalent to each other. So when I run this, I'm gonna get 6. So all of them are gonna give me 6. I can also do this with minus minus, and I'm gonna get 4. Now unfortunately I can't do this with, let's say 2. If I do x minus 2 instead of, if I wanted to de-increment by 2, I'm still gonna get 5 because it doesn't really know the syntax, and it's just gonna do x minus 2, but it's not gonna set it equal back to x. So you can only do this minus minus or plus plus when you're incrementing or de-incrementing by 1. And also you can't do this with multiplication or exponents because it's just going to give you an error. Alright, so that's enough with incrementing and de-incrementing. So now let's talk about equality and inequality when it comes to programming and our variables. So again, I'm going to create another variable called y and set that equal to 10. And I'm going to create an expression in here and say x equals y. So what this expression tells me, or what it's trying to figure out, is if x is equal to y. And the reason we use double equal signs here instead of just a single equal sign is because we're not setting x equal to y, we're not making a new variable here, we're actually comparing the two. So in this case, when we're setting a variable, we want to use one equal sign, but when we're comparing these two variables, we want to use 2 of them. So what this basically is saying, it's checking if x is equal to y. So let's run this and see what it says, and it's going to say false because x, which is 5, equals 10 is a false statement. 5 does not equal 10. We can also do this with the not equal sign, which we denote by putting an exclamation point and then an equal sign. And if we run this, we're going to get true because it's a fact that 5 is not equal to 10. That is a true statement there. Now, we can also increase the specificity of the way we compare equality. So again, if I kept this equals equals, and let's say I changed y to 5, but instead I put it as a string. So I want you to think about what this might print to the console. Is it going to be true or is it going to be false? Is x going to be equal to y or is it not? So let's run this and see. So it actually returns true. And this is because the double equal sign only cares about the value of the variable. It doesn't care at all about the data type. So if it sees that the value of this variable is 5 and the value of this variable is 5, then it's going to say that they're equal. Even though that this is a number and this one is a string, they have different data types. Well, let's say you wanted to make sure that they had the same data type as well as the same value. What you can do is add a triple equal sign, and this will compare the data type as well as the value. So if I run this, we will get false because these two, although they have the same value of 5, they do not have the same data type. This one's a string and this one is a number. And you can also do the same for the not equals. You just put a exclamation point in front there and you run that and we get true. Alright, so now let's move on to more comparison operators, and we're going to be moving towards the greater than signs, the less than signs, and the equal signs. So what I can do is check if x is greater than y, and if I run that, it's going to say false because, or actually, let me change that to a 10, that would make more sense. If I run that, I'm going to get false because 5 is greater than 10. That is not a true statement, so it's going to return false. Now, I can also do less than, and that's going to return true because 10 is less than 5, or 5 is less than 10, sorry. And we can also change this to, we put an equal sign at the end, and we can do that with the opposite sign as well, and yes. Now we can also not only do this with numbers, but we can also do it with strings. So I'm going to set x equal to a and y equal to b, and these are both strings because of the quotations. So again, let's try and compare this. So if I say x is greater than y, I'm saying a is a greater than b. Well, you're probably thinking, how can a letter be greater than a letter? They're not numbers. Well, let's try and run this. It's going to print false because the way JavaScript handles this is alphabetically. So essentially, a is assigned the number 1, and b is assigned the number 2, and c 3, and d 4, and so on and so forth. So when I say a is greater than b, I'm really saying is 1 greater than 2, and that's going to be false, so it's going to return false. Now if I do this the opposite way, and I run that, it's going to be true because a is less than b in this alphabetical order that JavaScript follows. Now we're at our final operator. I know we've been through a lot today. It's definitely confusing at first, but if you rewatch this video, maybe pause it a couple times and try to code along, you'll definitely get the hang of it. And even if it's just practicing 10 to 15 minutes a day, you're going to be getting better at coding, and it may take a while at first, It definitely took me a while to kind of grasp these concepts, but just keep persevering, and the fact that you made it this far in this workshop is something to be proud of by itself. So without further ado, let's get into logical operators. So this is our last operator of the day. They're very similar to the other operators we've talked about when comparing true or false. So what I'm going to do here is put ampersand ampersand, and what this expression means is it's saying that it's checking if x and y are true. And if x and y are true, this whole thing is going to be false. The ampersand ampersand is the same thing as saying and, so it's saying it's going to check if x is true, and it's going to check if y is true. And before I run that, I probably want to change these to Boolean so it actually kind of makes sense. So I'm going to set this one to true and set this one to false, and let's run that. So this is going to say false because although x is true, in order for this whole thing to be true, y also has to be true, and y is not true, it's false, so this whole thing is going to be false. Now, I can also use the OR operator, and I don't know what these symbols are called, but on my keyboard it's located on the top right. I think you have to press shift, to get it. But this stands for OR, and it's basically checking if x is true or y is true, then this whole thing is going to be true. So let's run that. And we see we get true, because for this whole thing to be true, only one of these two variables has to be true. So in this case, x is true, so that means the whole thing is true. It doesn't even have to check y. But if it were to check y, so x is true, but y is false, it doesn't matter because we only need one to make the whole thing true. Now, we also have the negation symbol, which is the exclamation point. So we can negate one of these variables. So if I put an exclamation point in front of x, it's basically gonna say, it's gonna take the value of x and see that it's true, and then when it sees this exclamation point, it's going to take the opposite of that value. So let's try and run this, and we see we get false, because although x is true, we're taking the opposite value of x, and the opposite value of true is going to be false. So this whole thing here is going to be false, and then we're going to check y. If y is true, if y is false, which it is, then this whole thing is going to be false. And if I did that to the other side, if I negated the y, I would get true because x is true, and then y is false, but the negation of y, which is the opposite of y, so the opposite of false, is going to be true. So this is both true, and if I change this to an ampersand, it's also going to be true. So we went over a lot today. Again, I know this can be confusing, especially if you're a beginner. This is more of the complicated lessons so far. HTML and CSS are a lot of just copying and memorization, but this stuff is more about logic and the real brains of our website. So next class we'll be getting into more of these JavaScript concepts. We'll be looking at conditionals and loops, and we may even get into some manipulation of our website using JavaScript. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the live chat or the comments, and you can also email me. All of my resources are in the description. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.